Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining me this evening. I'm here with Odon and I'm here with JC. We're going to be discussing how did the current myth of Muhammad begin? Do we have a thesis? Does this thesis overlap with the work that Odon's been doing? I'm just here because of my good looks and silky voice. I'm not sure what my contribution will be here, except to host these two fine minds. But JC, as you may or may not know, is an author. He writes fiction, but it's fiction based around Islam. And as an author, he's starting to see narrative threads, and he's now been working for the last couple of years on figuring out these narrative connections. And I believe he's come upon ideas that are very, very compelling as to how the authors of the Quran, the authors of the standard Islamic narrative started to assemble the story, what stories they modified and added. And Odon is here, obviously, to add his incredible historical knowledge. And between the two of them, it seems that we have a convergence. So welcome, guys. Welcome, Odon. Welcome, JC. Introduce yourselves, and let's, JC, also let the audience know what we're going to be talking about.
Thank you, Lloyd, and thank you, Odon. It's great to actually be here. We're going to talk about something, I think, very, very cool, because we're going to try to look at the history of how Muhammad was created, but from the myth point of view, as opposed to really the historical angle. The majority of the stories that we have about Muhammad, they actually come from Muslims, and very often those stories are the same story, but then divided in, say, two parts. A very quick example would be, for example, if Lloyd, you ask people to start calling you emperor, and then after 500 years, that story has now morphed, and they have one character that was called Lloyd and another character called emperor, and they think that there are two, but they were always the same. And we have agreed, I think all scholars now believe that Muhammad was a title, but we don't have the name. So what I'm going to try and prove today is that we have the title, but we also have the name, and we just had to link them together. And if I'm successful, hopefully we're going to start having that kind of avenue of research into who the original inspirations for Muhammad actually were.
Right. Before Odon introduces himself and adds his thoughts, I'd like to mention that JC was also just as intimidated by Odon as I was, and was also very nervous that Odon was going to drop him from a dizzy height and leave his ideas and his tender, what would you call it? Just leave him a blubbering mess, feeling that Odon had just dropped a megaton bomb on him from a dizzy height. But apparently Odon has gone like, that's a really good idea there. Well, let's so guys, I want to let you know Odon has been friendly and there's no need to worry. For those of you at home who are concerned, no need. So, thanks, Odon. Welcome.
Come on, Lloyd. You know me. I think your audience is starting to know me a bit also. It's something like the 10th or 11th or maybe 12th time I am on your channel. So they know I'm all about friendliness and charity. And
You're right. No, it's just that your thesis is so informed. It's so deeply detailed that the fact that you've written a book and that you know the subject so well by heart and you associate with all of these top scholars, I mean, something that I don't have access to, so obviously, therefore, I coming at this as an amateur. I know you also said that you're an amateur, but the fact that I come at this as an amateur, it's obviously there's always a little concern, so.
Yeah, I'm a sort of amateur too, but the thing I got very lucky with is to meet Dr. Edouard Marie-Galès, who is the real knowledgeable one, the one who did the research 20 years ago. And what I did is built on his expertise and his knowledge by sort of benchmarking the new discoveries, the new researches from Western, not only Western, but from academic scholarship. And also have a sort of unusual background in this field. So I am not a novelist or an author like JC. What I did was strategy consulting business. And so I have the mind of a strategy consultant who tries to understand the big picture. And this is what really really lacks. There is really a lack of understanding of the big picture in the scholarship milieu.
So think of that as an overall thesis, putting together a overall thesis, and then you can then fit your narrative into it.
Scholars don't want to engage in such a thing.
Right.
I came across a thread on X from Paul Ellis. Paul Ellis is the one who published a very dense article on the Jerusalem thesis. Very interesting article. I met him in London, and last summer he attended an ICSA, so International Quran Seminar Association or something like this, conference. So there were top-notch scholars from all around the world sharing their discoveries about the Quran. And he was very pleased with all this. There were tens of conferences and lessons and lectures and so on. But what really amazed him is that not one of those scholars tried to understand what his research was about. They were very happy about describing a surah, a verse, a story within the Quran, but none of them tried to understand who wrote the Quran, why was it written, how did Islam emerge. It seemed it was not a thing of interest for them.
Well, as I've said, they have the dots, they refuse to connect them. And I think JC is going to be connecting the dots today. He's going to help us from a narrative perspective, from an author's perspective, how these authors of the narrative created that. So JC, over to you.
Right. So, well, let me actually share my screen, and then we can go through some slides and see if we can actually make sense of anything, or at least just add a couple of strokes to this picture that we are very, very slowly just starting to understand. Share, and let's see. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, there it is.
It's not in full screen yet.
Yeah. No? Great. So let's see. If I'm successful, we will hopefully walk away thinking, okay, yeah, so Muhammad actually could have been that guy, and maybe we look into him and find more about his story. But first, we actually are going to have a look at this map. So when we look at this map, to understand a little bit how the narrative actually changed, we were told that everything started right there in Yathrib, and then within 40 years, these people, who the story says they were caravan traders and stuff, they had conquered all of that. Now, that is not a map that is not the level of conquest that you get from caravan traders. This is the sort of things that people like Alexander the Great did, who had his father was a military leader, or Genghis Khan, Hannibal Barca, people who were professionals. This is not something that happens because some caravan traders, who they are pretty much in their 40s, they all have a middle-age crisis and they say, hey, let's actually build an empire and conquer Jerusalem.
Right.
It doesn't happen. What we're looking at...
the traders were based in Yemen, not in Central Arabia. No, the traders were also based in Yemen, not in Central Arabia. The location is wrong.
Yeah, Mecca, it wasn't even there at all anyway. So, but these people, like the tribes, and I don't actually want to say some names because they will appear later, but Muhammad was supposed to be a trader that was going all the way to Jerusalem, up and down. It doesn't happen. That level of conquest, we are dealing with very highly trained, high-rank, elite military. And actually in Odon's book, which I'm actually halfway through, is phenomenal. I was very happy to see that Odon was writing a lot about the conflicts with the tribes and the fights. Because when we talk about Islam, we normally think, okay, Yathrib, Islam, revelations, and everything expanded. And it's like, no. These are people just conquering territory. So we have to start thinking about these people, knowing what they were doing, and there was a reason, and we will get to that. Now, in short, and this is not something that we will discuss today, but pretty much the Quran are notes from a preacher. That's why they have all of those contradictions and they're so wrong. It has a little bit more than that. The hadiths are nothing but old wise tales, and that chain of narration, going through Abdul Malik, who was an anti-Trinitarian, and then Yazid and Muawiyah, who were Christians, right, to a person that didn't exist. The chain of narration was always 100% fabricated. So, and then Al-Tabari, which we're going to see. Al-Tabari was obviously later, but what we're taking from him is not the history, it's actually the stories, because the stories are important. It is basically like the hadiths, but they really put a lot of effort into it. They actually speak with better people who are descendants of people at the palaces, they read books. So it's almost like the hadiths, but they are at least, checking the information a little bit. But let's go and have a look at the next two slides, like very, very briefly. There are lots of people that influenced the story of Muhammad, but this is just things that we can discuss at another point because we want to find the actual guys that started everything. Lots of things that are being told about Muhammad was Jesus. They call him the light. Everything that he says is the words of God, and so on and so forth. And we could talk about that for days. They didn't have a character, so they copied from Jesus. Another important guy was Abdul Malik. If you go through Al-Tabari, you will see.
JC, just go back one for a moment. It should be noted, in Islam, in the Sharia, there is a concept of embellishment. We would call it exaggeration, but it's part of the prose structure, of the narrative structure of Islam, where you have a style of embellishment of a story that is permitted. So effectively, adding details to a story that are not necessarily true, that make it better, with the idea that what is beautiful is true. So if the story is more beautiful, it is more true. And Jesus enters on a donkey, Muhammad enters on a flying donkey. So there's this element of exaggeration we should also be aware of, that is part of the story. And does that add to the thesis that you're speaking of?
Yes, they don't have a character, and we will see, hopefully we will see exactly why. So for that reason, they hear all of these different stories and they make sense of them. And normally when you are actually copying from stories that you've heard, you will tend to make them bigger. Because, for example, one thing that we will see is why is the story about Muhammad dying of poison is because the original guy died in a different manner, and people wouldn't remember that. They wouldn't actually care. But that's probably as well for a different conversation. If the stories are bigger, then people will remember them, and those are the stories that people will tell more, rather
Yeah, I just want to show everyone
the other things. I mean, when you're going through the hadiths and you see that people kept talking about the sexual actions of the prophet, it's like, why did you not have gossip in those days? Why were you actually telling the things that the prophet did? Because they were interested in this kind of like gossip. So the stories always change, and whatever they like, it's maintained. Right. Otherwise, you exaggerate them or they just disappear.
Yeah, I'm just showing the audience on the screen at the moment what is called the ilm al-badi. Islam always talks about its sciences, its ilm, right? Islam is the religion of science. So you've got the science of hadith, you've got the science of the isnads. Here you've got the science, the ilm al-badi, which is the rhetorical science, the science of rhetoric. Rhetoric, is that a science? No, but whatever. The branch of rhetorical science which deals with the beautification of literary style, the artifices of ornamentation. Notice artifice means artificial creation of additional details to prettify a story, and embellishment of speech. Artifice is to lie, effectively. It's to lie. So beautification, ornamental lies, and embellishment, exaggeration. And that's the science of rhetoric. Any thoughts from you on this, Odon?
You translate alim by science, but actually it doesn't really mean science. It means knowledge.
Sure. Yeah, but
when we say science,
this is the Encyclopedia of Islam. I mean, this is how they understand it. So
of course. But Muslim scholars are not scientists. They are only knowledgeable in terms of Islam history, Islam narrative. Science implies logic, reason.
We're not accusing them of being honest at any point.
I have also another remark. It's on JC's slide about Jesus. There's one blatant connection between Jesus and the Prophet of Islam. It's his name. I don't know whether JC will address this topic in your presentation, but Jesus is supposed to be the Messiah. In the Messianic tradition, Christian as well as Jewish, but here we look at the Christian tradition. If you look at the Bible, the Song of Solomon, chapter 5, verse 16, talks about the beloved, who is Mahmadin. Mahmadin. Mahmadin meaning desired. It is exactly the same word as Mahmad or Muhammad in Arabic. So Mahmad, actually, it was a messianic title for the Messiah, or those who pretended to be the Messiah in his stead. And so there is a connection here between another connection. There is the light, the God words, the donkey, and so on. But the name Mahmad, it's something to think about.
Yeah, this is not something that I had in this presentation, because the stories of Jesus, adding them to Muhammad, they happen much later, the same like with Abdul Malik. But like on a different presentation, I did actually have this whole thing of obviously Muhammad being the praised one, or the Messiah, and being Jesus. And in my mind, I think when people were going to write the hadith, they asked people something like, hey, what do you know about Muhammad or the Muhammad? And some people then would think, okay, well, I heard about this guy, and they actually thought they heard the stories of Jesus, the Muhammad, and then they told those stories, and then they will ask somebody else, and that somebody thought, oh, the Muhammad, and they're thinking, oh, that was Abdul Malik, and then they would tell those stories. So that's why everybody seems to be Muhammad, but they're talking about very different characters. So I'm not addressing that one simply because because these things happen much, much later. And I'm trying to actually pin everything to the very, very beginning of the whole story. Mm-hmm. But yeah, very, very good point. And Abdul Malik, this one would deserve a whole presentation. It's a lot of fun. Anyone who wants to actually read through Al-Tabari, you will see lots of things there that will just make you laugh. There are things that I actually read and I thought, no, there is no way they wrote that. They would write a story about Abdul Malik, and you see that story is about Muhammad. So it's almost like the same. Like there are lots of parallels, even though the stories probably never happened, but the stories were still being told for hundreds of years. So if they are in Al-Tabari, the story was being told, whether true or false. But once again, Abdul Malik, even though he has a lot to do with the pretty much proliferation of Islam, he's way too late, and we're going to look for who actually started the whole thing, hopefully. And we begin with this. I think this is the most important document that we're going to discuss today, which is obviously the letters from Leo III. He was a very important guy, the emperor of Byzantium, and the guy who actually invented Photoshop. I got the evidence right there. So this guy wrote to Umar II in his letters, and he's actually addresses the letters by saying the Furqan, the book, the Quran. So those people are having something around that time. And he says that the people who did it were Umar, Abu Turab, who is supposed to be Ali, and Salman. He says that. He also says that then Al-Hajjaj takes that and he does the canonization. So he's pretty much the one that does the Uthman move, according to this guy. And that there is the rumor already going around that book actually came down from the heavens, because of course, as we all know, it doesn't have any contradictions except for the million contradictions. So when historians, they try to look for the actual evidence of facts that we can prove and say, okay, so that happened. I think this is the most important document that we have, because this guy was the emperor of Byzantium. This guy would not have gotten his data from some traveling merchant who said, hey, give me a coin and I'll tell you a story. This guy would have had spies everywhere. Byzantium was the biggest empire. He would not send a letter to another king and make a fool of himself. So if this guy said that Umar Ali, I'm going to call him Ali, and Salman started the whole thing, then he did it. And the response from Umar II is actually worth reading. I can't remember it now very well, but I think it's very much like the modern Muslim apologist. He doesn't say, what are you talking about? Of course we had a prophet. He just says, oh yeah, you want to tell me about religion? Jesus didn't die. Things like that. It's like, you're not addressing the problem. So that was actually very, very cool. So if the Emperor of Byzantium said that, what I say is fair enough. Let's see if he was 100% right, because I think his information would be valid. And those are the original Muhammad's, or the ones that inspire the story. And out of this, we also learned something very, very important, which is that Muhammad was the first woke activist in history, because his pronouns were they, them. Any comments about this?
He's directly saying that the Quran was written and brought on as you pretend for your Furqan. He's bluntly stating you are pretending that this is the case. It was Umar, Abu Turab, and Salman the Persian who composed that book. I'm not sure who Abu Turab is, and the rumor has got around among you that Allah sent it down from the heavens. And then he says, Hajjaj had men gather up your ancient books, which were replaced by others composed by himself, and then he propagated those. I mean, that's a pretty blunt accusation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Umar II doesn't. I think I read the letters. I don't think he dismisses that in any way. He just basically says something like, "Well, Jesus didn't die on the cross, or you worship a man," or something just like the typical Muslim apologist to this day. Instead of saying, "No, what are you talking about? Of course we had a prophet." So, yeah. I think his information is perfectly valid, and hopefully we're going to actually see why I think these letters actually make sense with the whole stories that we get from these guys. And Odon, do you have any comments about this, or are you happy with this approach?
For the audience, they can read an article from Robert Hoyland, who studies this letter. It's on his academia page, named Correspondence between Leo III and Umar II. So Umar was Umar ibn al-Aziz. And also there is Stephen Shoemaker's book, Creating the Quran, which is also available for free as a free PDF version on his academia page, where he argues that Al-Hajjaj is the one who created the Quran based on evidence such as this letter.
Certainly, his bloody fingerprints are all over it. And at one point, I actually thought it was all about Abdul Malik and him. Certainly, they do have a lot of influence, but the myth had already started. But yes, I think he ends up the one probably commissioning the guy that has gone down in history as Ibn Thabit, actually compiling it and sending it out. But that's probably conversation for another time. Now, with Leo III as well, I think the reason why the John of Damascus, which we're going to talk about him in a sec, he didn't know anything about Islam when he was there at the end of the 7th century, is because he was in Syria, and those regions, well, the Levant and Egypt, they didn't really speak Arabic. If the book was never really even translated out of Arabic, even the stories would have been told in Arabic mostly. So it would never really have made an organic move into those regions because people just didn't speak the language. It's only after Abdul Malik, he does the Arabization, that Islam can really spread freely. People shouldn't learn Arabic, maybe safer that way. So Islam spreads first, I think, in Arabia and Persia, but it's not actually Islam yet. Abdul Malik, I wrote here that he converts in the 690s. He probably didn't convert. He was basically brought up already as following this heresy, but then he takes things to a whole different level when he does he implements the Arabization of the kingdom. There is no concept of Khalifa, even at that point, during Abdul Malik. That happens much later. up to that point, I actually don't know if he was called a king or something else. And before his time, there is no Islam, but there are stories floating around, which then will become Islam later. So,
JC, please. What do you mean exactly with this phrase? There's no concept of Khalifa.
That the concept of like successor would have been when during the Abbasids, when they already have the Quran, people are already reading that thing, and it really becomes a religion. That when Abdul Malik was around, the concept of Caliph or successor on earth wouldn't really be a thing because there is no religion really. So his title would have been probably an emperor or something of the sort.
But do you know that Abdul Malik is the first Arab leader to have borne the title Khalif, but not as successor of Muhammad, but as God's deputy on earth.
That would make sense, particularly because of the Muhammad thing that we will discuss, that he would say, okay, yeah, I'm the Messiah. So, or rather moving that to Khalifa. So no, I didn't know. I actually thought that nobody used that title until, a few generations later, but that's good info.
The Khalifa title as successor of Muhammad is an Abbasid invention. Before the Abbasids, the successor of Abdul Malik bore the title Khalifa, but not as successors of Muhammad, but as God's deputy, or maybe successors of Abdul Malik, but not of Muhammad as the prophet of Islam. There is a book from Patricia Crone on this topic, God's Caliph, with Martin Hinz. Very interesting because she put forth that there was absolutely no mention of Khalifa before the Abbasid as referring to a succession of Muhammad as the prophet of Islam. They were the Abbasid who invented it, the idea that they were the successor of a prophet.
That actually would make like a lot of sense because the Abbasids taking pride of basically being the successors of Al-Abbas and really direct, almost blood successors of the Prophet. So yeah, that's great info. But it also means that Abdul Malik, he had a very, very big head that could be seen from the moon, calling himself like the, the chosen one almost by God. So what a guy. And the Muhammad. So I'm not really sure I understand this fully. I think the way that I see it is there were Jewish people who would say, hey, I'm the Muhammad, I'm going to build a third temple. And then within 5 minutes, they get killed. And then somebody says, no, I'm the Muhammad. Trust me, he will lie to you. And then they try to build the third temple and then they get killed. But Muhammad means, well, the Messiah and the guy that builds the third temple, that it is very much attached to that, like the way that I see it. Now, this guy, I think, knows a lot about it. I've seen lots of his videos when he talks about the Mahmads, the Excelars and stuff. So probably a very good place where to begin if people are doing this research. And the way that I see it is like very simply, if you build the third temple, then you are the Mahmad. If Benjamin Netanyahu builds now the third temple, it's like, congratulations, he's the Mahmad. And it would be almost like the Messiah, but the one that actually just builds the temple. It's very action-based. If Lloyd, you fly to Jerusalem on a flying donkey because there is a precedence, and by night you just build a temple very quickly, congratulations, you are the Mahmad. So I think it's something like that direct. Would you guys agree with that very brief explanation of what the title Mahmad would signify to these people?
So the praised one gets things done because the Jews had a concept of the Messiah that was a warrior who would fight and deliver them freedom from the Romans. So this is someone who's going to restore the religion, restore the temple. So there could be a parallel there.
I fully agree. The temple was rebuilt around 638. According to the Islamic narrative, Umar supervised the rebuilding or the building of this third temple. He was a Mahmad. He was a Muhammad. He was nicknamed Al Farouk, the savior. The savior.
Yeah. So I think that is just the second piece of evidence. On the one hand, we had the letters from Leo III, and on the second one is simply the title. If the Muhammad is he who builds the temple, it's like, okay, so who was the Muhammad? He who built the temple. Umar built the temple, so he might at that point, maybe earlier, said, hey, guess what? I've built the temple, so I'm the Muhammad. And that's that. Very action-based, nothing to do really with religion, because he's certainly not Jewish. If the Quran is any judge of that, and there are other things in the Hadiths. So those two pieces of evidence, he didn't call himself king, or this title didn't go down as a king because they had a kingdom, or emperor because they had an empire, but the Muhammad, which is a title really attached to building the temple. So find who built the temple, find Muhammad. I think it's probably as simple as that. And the letter from Leo III is like right there, saying that it started with them. So I think everything really fits, and we're going to really try and find now Umar and Salman, because I don't care about Ali. We're going to find those guys everywhere in the Quran. The verses that come from them, we're going to find them in other stories to try to say, yeah, it was these guys. And on the one hand, anything to do with violence came from the actions and the words of Umar, and anything more passive or religious would be Salman. So hopefully we can evidence that. And for that, very briefly, let me just talk very briefly about John of Damascus. So his Heresy of the Ishmaelites. So he's there and in Damascus, and he actually moves from Damascus in the year 705. So maybe he was the one that killed Abdul Malik. No, probably not. But he was there, he talked with people. He didn't have an idea about Muslims or Islam. He doesn't mention that. Also, in his works, he mentions basically the story of Bahira, which is fine. So, some stories are already being told. But something that caught my attention is that he says from that time, when people were licking stones, until the present, a prophet has appeared. He doesn't say at this point 40 years ago, or he doesn't say that. It's almost like someone has appeared that you would think that they would know exactly who that person is. It's almost like they are getting confused between the Muhammad and the people in history. Then he says that this person got in good grace. It's like, that actually sounds like Solomon. The book becomes an object of veneration. Yep. And it has many ridiculous books. I think it's talking about the Quran. And of course, John of Damascus mentions the chapters women, cow, table, and camel. And because camel is not there, Muslims often say, well, you see, he's not trustworthy. But hey, there were some verses of stoning and breastfeeding an adult that were eaten by a goat or a sheep, and there were other surahs missing. So the camel was a whole story that was removed, even though you still have a couple of places in the Quran that mentions the camel of God. So the fact that he's making so many mistakes in his account is telling us that that is what was happening at the time. People didn't know much about it. In fact, he says things like this. He discusses about Mary being the sister of Aaron, that is in the Quran, and that God took Jesus to himself. That's in the Quran, but this one is not in the Quran. When he says that God asked Jesus, did you say to them, you are the Son of God and God? But that's not what the Quran says. The Quran says, did you say you and your mother as deities? So either he was just talking with people and they didn't really know this thing very well, or that was actually changed. He would certainly have said something about it if that was brought to his attention. Other things, he makes fun of the stories that he heard, the revelation coming to this Muhammad in his sleep, when he was asleep. So he's making fun of that. He's making fun about the stone, which people are telling him different stories. It's like they are not really sure what this stone they need to lick is about. It's very weird. People don't know about it. But also, I found it interesting that he doesn't call it black stone. Maybe we call it the black stone. Maybe back in those days they were more politically correct, and they just didn't want to call it black stone. But it's also possible that they had a different stone altogether. Just as a side note, because it was, according to him, carved as the head of Aphrodite. So, and then this one, which is important, the story of Zayd, which he says was a friend as opposed to an adopted son. And after the whole story of God wants you to divorce your wife, God wants me to marry your wife, because that's the kind of guy that you want to get revelations from God. But then he says this: furthermore, if a brother puts away his wife, let his brother marry her, should he so wish. So he doesn't talk about the adopted son, and then he has that weird thing about brother, but we will see actually why. Now, the important things about John of Damascus not only is the problems, the things that he gets wrong, which I think tells us exactly what was happening at the time, is that he doesn't talk about Mary being part of the Trinity. This guy would have talked about it. He would have talked, what do you mean that Abraham was going to kill Ishmael? It was Isaac. He doesn't talk about that. He doesn't call the black stone. He doesn't say they're calling Yahweh Allah for some reason. He doesn't talk about their oral tradition. He doesn't talk about the cave of Hira or Jibril. He says that the revelations came in his sleep. He doesn't mention the Quran, but it doesn't really matter. He would have just said the book, and nobody cares. And also, iconoclasm. John of Damascus was famous because of his writings about iconoclasm, which of course they were all sorted after his death. But he felt very, very, very strongly on that matter. So when Abdul Malik prohibited images, I would have thought that this guy would have had something to say about it if it was things to do with Islam, and probably he would have discussed things about Abdul Malik's beliefs. However, most importantly, why wouldn't John of Damascus talk about Muhammad being a warrior king? If he was a prophet, this guy would have made a meal out of that. He doesn't talk about the caravan robins, the executions. He doesn't mention stories outside of the Quran. It's almost like those actually happened, they were built into the story of Muhammad later. He doesn't talk about the hadiths. He doesn't talk about the many wives of the Prophet, about the Miraj. These are the things he would have said. The reader wars, the succession wars. He doesn't say, well, Abdul Malik is here ruling because he is, he's entitled to rule because of Muhammad. Those things are not discussed. He doesn't talk about the jizya. He's in Damascus and he has his head attached to his body, which means there is no Islam. He doesn't talk about the caliphate in the way that we know it, going all the way from, Muhammad to Rashidun and then the Umayyads. He doesn't talk about the Jew hatred. But most importantly, he doesn't talk about the death of Muhammad. And this one is something that got me scratching my head, because he's an apologist. He would make a meal out of the death of the Prophet. If he had died in battle, this guy would have talked about it. If he had died of poison, the same. If he was still alive, he would have talked about it. If he asked the guys, hey, so you had a prophet, so is he alive? Can I speak with him? No, he's dead. How did he die? This is the one thing that every single follower of this cult, they would have known. And if he didn't speak about it in any possible way, I think the only explanation is that those guys he was speaking with thought that their Muhammad had died of old age. So it would be the only reason that this guy wouldn't actually discuss it. Otherwise, why wouldn't he? He would be still talking about it and making fun of it. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, when I have read John of Damascus writings, and the character of Muhammad is not defined at all, and this is something he sort of insists on. He explained how ridiculous Ishmaelites are because they cannot justify their belief, and he talks about their shame. They are ashamed of not being able to justify what they believe in. this is very, very. It shows us that Islam did not exist. It was not fully formed yet, and so the character of the prophet was not was only at its beginning.
Yeah,
So
and I really like when in his letters, in his writings, he says this, that is kind of like passive aggressive, when he says, and we ask them the questions, and we ask them questions, and they say, oh, God knows best. And he writes, this we say, we know. And it's like he's being passive aggressive in his writings. I love it. This is passive aggressiveness from the 7th century. Well done, Johnny.
Mm-hmm. There's one thing also about his writings. Should Islam have existed with his jizya and so on, he could never have written such a thing, because it's too much anti-Islam to be allowed. This led some scholars, contemporary scholars, to hypothesize that some of his writings might be apocryphal. They were written after him in the Byzantine Empire, but it might be for some of them, but mostly I think it is a proof that Islam was not formed yet.
but Islam does change in response to challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So when Islam encounters polemics, it changes its story, it adapts, and also it adopts new things. It absorbs part of whatever it comes across. So it, I mean, now there's a new thing going around. I just saw from Jesus was a Muslim. I've been seeing Moses was a Muslim, Abraham was a Muslim. Now suddenly Mother Mary was a Muslim. I mean, they're making these statements on social media. It's ridiculous. They can't prove it, but they are simply asserting.
This is the way Islam was created. It was built on its own contradictions, its own incoherencies. When they were unveiled by people like John of Damascus or others, even Muslim people, they had to reconsider those stories and erase them and rewrite them, or they had to invent other stories to serve as an explanation, to add some legitimacy and to sort of treat or cope with the incoherencies.
And you'll find web pages now that are trying to say, well, see, John of Damascus was actually just a liar. He clearly had no idea what he was talking about. He was a deeply ignorant man. How could he not know Islam? He was clearly just making things up. He was clearly just fabricating things. So that's one side of the argument as it stands now. Instead of going, okay, John of Damascus was a credible witness from that period, who in all other things seems to be an entirely credible witness and reliable. Rather than Islam didn't exist, it's John of Damascus was making up fabrications. So one has to really pick at the moment, because scholarship, and I'm assuming Islam is pushing hard on the one side here, is trying to create the idea that John of Damascus was a totally unreliable witness who just fabricated and invented evidence. Whereas obviously the uncomfortable conclusion is that what he saw was that Islam did not exist as we know it today. So Islam must be a much later invention.
Yeah, and the thing is as well that the letters from Leo III happened after John of Damascus. I know that we don't know exactly when he wrote the things, but I do think that he actually had these conversations when he was actually quite young, as opposed to when he was already a monk, because that's when he would have been full of energy and in Damascus and asking questions and doing all of that. At least that's kind of like my feeling. But when we put the stories of John of Damascus with the letters of Leo III, it's like, oh, look, they actually fit. It looks like there was no real Islam. And even Umar II doesn't really come up with any stories. But also when you write something, say that the stories, the heresy of the Ismailites was written later. If it was written later, they wouldn't get so many errors. That's kind of like the whole point, that they would put more things into it. They would say, things about the hadiths. But the fact that this guy doesn't talk, look about all of the things on the screen. All of those things are incredibly important, but none of those are really in the Quran. There are some things like the whole thing about the wives, but he's not talking about anything of that level of significance. If this was written later, the guys writing it, they would have made fun of the death of the prophet. They would have talked about the very naughty things that he did, but not this guy. So yeah, the story was just written later. And when we look at the correspondence from Leo III, which is kind of like what we're trying to do, is like, well, did he make sense? And he does. So far, we're saying that yes, Islam was really starting to just appear as a heresy around the late 7th century, and things really got out of hand within 100 years of that. But that's
Also,
much later on. So
an odd parallel. You had the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These people, whoever they were, who were coming up with a new religion, also had 4 books. I mean, what did you have? You had the chair, the cow, the table, and the women, or the camel, well, whatever it was. The cow, the table, the women, and the camel. They also had 4 books. So that's just an odd parallel. I mean, Muhammad had 12 companions. I know there's a very famous religious figure from the 1st century that also had 12 companions. Can anyone help me out here? You know, it's just they have all these parallels that they seem to be stealing from things that already exist. So 4 books versus 4 books. I mean, the Kitab al-Sitta, 6 books. The Jews also in their Talmud had 6 major books, you know, plus additional ones. So just they seem to be just copying left and right.
come on, they didn't actually steal anything. Oh, by the way, they invented algebra too.
And the Volvo.
Yeah, it's everything. It's wherever they go. It's like, yeah. That was us, definitely us. And it's like, no, but really, and we will see later as well. Like they didn't have a story, and they had to build a story. So they actually put a lot of their stuff, but they copied from absolutely every single legend. I mean, look even at the Quran. The story's in there. There is one that actually annoys me, and nobody talks about it, but it really annoys me. So I'll just say it very briefly. The one about Moses going to this guy who immediately kills a child. And I hate that. It's like Moses goes to this guy who says, can you please teach me how to read the signs? And it's like, okay, guys, let's get this straight. Moses, he was famously speaking with God face to face. If there is one guy in the whole Abrahamic faith who would not go to somebody else to ask, hey, can you teach me how to read the signs? Like what signs? The stars? You're talking with God like face to face. You have him on a speed dial, and then yet you have that story of Moses going with a psychopath to learn stuff. Is like, guys, come on. So that story really annoys me. Anyway, I thought I would just share.
We've just discovered DXist assures us that Pythagoras was a Muslim. So
of course,
there you go. That's just how that is. A point that I wanted to make, and not now because of what I saw with Pythagoras, I've half forgotten my point. It'll come back to me, and I'll raise it again.
and if you remember about Pythagoras, then we can discuss it. So, should we go with one of the big names and see what we find and where we find him? Mr. Salman al-Farisi. So, this guy, he appears in the Life of Muhammad. Anyone who hasn't actually read
just
that,
hold on a second. I just realized what my point was.
Yeah.
Apologies for the interruption.
No, go.
When I did my talks on St. Paul, on the Muslim hatred of St. Paul, as well as their claims of tahrif, which is the corruption of the Bible, looking at the 2 different versions of scholarship, where the one is saying, no, the Bible was physically edited, the words were physically changed and rewritten. The other one is that the Bible has simply been misunderstood or misinterpreted. What seems evident to me is that the reaction to the Bible being rewritten seems to happen somewhere in the late 9th century, some in the 9th century, approximately around the time that they invaded Spain. So they've already invaded Spain, they've conquered Spain, and at some point, it appears that one of the scholars bothers to take the time to actually pick up and read a Bible. They finally have access to a full Bible. They read it and they go, oops, nothing in the Quran matches anything in this gospel, in this New Testament. Therefore, they start making accusations that the gospel was rewritten because it contradicts every story in the Quran. So that's what I took away from my research on the whole Tahrif story related to St. Paul. So they did not have a full Bible at the time. And so a lot of these things are very late. They add them later, and then they have to change the story. They have to come up with an excuse because they paint themselves into a corner.
I think that might have been, I think I read that one a long time ago. I think it was Ibn Hassam, the one that actually reads that and,
Yes.
and says, no, they're corrupt, something like that. Yeah.
There's another
Hold on.
thing about these tariff accusations. Actually, I think it also refers to the Quran itself and the Islamic reading of the Quran. In the Quran, there are accusations of tariff against the people of the book. They are supposed to have written the Holy Scriptures by themselves or to have distorted them. And so when the Quran was declared the divine word, they had to abide by the Quran. So they were constrained by their own interpretation of the Quran, and they had to invent these accusations. Actually, these accusations of falsification of tarif in the literal Quran, they don't refer to the Bible or to Christians. They refer to rabbinic Jews forging the Talmuds, or rabbinic Jews editing the prophecies about the coming of Jesus as the Messiah of Israel. But this actual history could not exist in the Islamic narrative. And so they had to invent and build upon their inventions. This is the way they fabricated the whole of the Islamic narrative. And so they invented stories upon stories upon stories, and they tried to take everything they could use to justify their own view, their own interpretation of the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like what you said before, that Islam was kind of built of contradictions on top of contradictions, and it's like this. Is like they create something and then they create more things, and then there are more plot holes. So they create things to cover those plot holes, and then they have more plot holes, and and then you end up with the Islam that we know today,
I mean,
right?
think of what they say about Mary in the Quran, right? There's 5 statements about Mary that are not in the Gospels, and thanks to Mackay John Kenneth for adding this in my comment section. There are 5 statements that are not in the Gospels, but in the infancy Gospel of Thomas and the Proto-Evangelium of James, right? So this is Mary went under the tree. She sat under the tree. She shook the tree, and dates. Jesus spoke in the cradle. Jesus molded birds and breathed life into them, and they flew, which paints Jesus as a very evil, nasty character. And daughter of Imran. So these are all, none of these are from actual Christian sources. They clearly didn't have access to those. They thought those were Christian. Thank you very much for that donation.
Should I continue with the
Yeah,
presentation? Yep. Right. So Salman, let's look at one of the big ones. So he appears in the life of Muhammad, which of course was compiled by just taking lots of things. It's about 2, maybe 3 pages. So anybody who has not, who's interested in this and wants to actually pin things on Salman, go and read it. It's really a 10-minute read, and that's pretty much just what it says. In short, this is what happens. So this guy is in Isfahan in Iran, and then he goes to Syria, meets a monk who is horrible. That monk dies. Then another one takes over who is very good, and he dies. And then he's moving to another monk who dies. And then he goes to another monk who says, hey, go to Arabia, go find him. Go to Arabia and go find the prophet because he's about to appear. And then the guy dies. So this guy is very much linked to the whole idea of Muhammad being a prophet. pretty much because he gave him food and the prophet didn't eat. I'm making a very long story short, but it's right there in the life of Muhammad. The story of Muhammad, or the story of a prophet, is linked to this guy. The stories were not written for 300 years. That's how I think they started to separate one and the other. And by the way, that message there is kind of like weird. So for hundreds of years, they remembered this guy saying that his daddy loved him more than the whole world. Like, Salman, nobody cares that you didn't have daddy issues. That should be the norm. But that is actually written hundreds of years later. We will see if we can find that same thing somewhere else, because the same story then goes to two different individuals, and that actually happens quite a bit. There is this weird story as well, where Salman says to the prophet who never existed that there is in this place where sick people go once a year, and then someone prays for them, and then they get healed. And then the prophet who never existed said to Salman, "Oh, then you met Jesus, the son of Mary." And he's like, "Well, guys, we were just talking about plot holes. If Jesus, the son of Mary, the Messiah, is coming down to earth once a year to heal the sick, just go and ask him for the revelations. Why do you go to Momo?" He's like, it's just silly. But that is in the life of Muhammad. So,
Right.
how? And this is
Just a
a
brief
little bit our
question.
story. Yep.
So there's a question from, I think it's Rane Shustic. I hope I pronounced that. It said, how many layers in the creation of Islam? I mean, that's a really difficult question to understand the question, never mind the answer. I mean, there's going to be a religious layer. There's going to be a legislative layer. There will be a narrative layer. There's going to be also, there's the divisions that Islam has broken into. There's going to be a level of understanding for the layman, for the imam, for the higher level of imam, and for the Sufis. So it's a fairly, at least 4 layers, 4 levels, but of understanding. But then there's also it's a soup. It's hard to. How would you answer this briefly, Odon?
It's very. I couldn't answer such a question because there are hundreds of stories that were built upon stories and stories and stories. If you take John of Damascus' testimony, during his time, there was a vague belief that there was someone who founded or created the Ishmaelite movement. So let's call him Muhammad. But he did not receive the revelation by an angel. He received it during his sleep. So we are here at a sort of early stage of building Islam. So there is this layer, for example, he received the revelation during his sleep. Thereafter came another layer. The angel Gabriel gave him the revelation. So it's another layer. And there was another layer thereafter. He went to the heavens and God presented him the celestial Quran, the mother of scripture. So another layer of revelation. And then so on and so on. And
we have to figure out what was backdated from the future to the past to try and give it legitimacy. And then you have different periods of editing and different geographies. It's a really tough question, but clearly there was a lot of work that went into this over centuries. Would you agree?
Centuries of work, fabrications, inventions, forgeries, editings. So one cannot answer the question of the number of layers.
Yeah, and the Islam definitely continues to evolve. The Sirah evolve all the time. The understanding of Islam adjusts to fit the culture, although the Sharia doesn't change. Mm-hmm. But JC, your thoughts on this? I mean, you're an author, so from a narrative point of view, there must be multiple layers.
Yeah, well, we could actually talk about it for days, probably, just because it does look almost like they are very almost reactive. There is a problem, and then they come up with something else, and then they do something else, and then no, pray more, and now tell yourself, don't have any doubts, that's haram, and then do this, and then they are changing things. And the game of Islam is almost like try to just keep people moving forward because if at any point anyone stops and looks at the mess, they're going to realize that we are lying to them. So we have to keep lying to them, putting more things so that they never get to the end of the lies, and everything just continues. And things like the stories, the Mirage not only was not invented at that point, it was not invented. That happened. I have no idea when the concept of the Mirage happened, but we discussed that one, Lloyd, on the
Yeah, but
previous
it's
time.
pre-existent in Zoroastrianism, and they could have borrowed it and just modified it.
Yeah, but the Quran, that verse, I think is Surah 17, verse 1, about the night journey, that is actually talking about Moses. And I got that from the Christian
Right.
prince, and it is spot on. But also, that surah used to be called Bani Israel. So if you read that, and you know that the title is Bani Israel, you get to the very first verse, you know that that is talking basically about the Exodus.
Well, the
He's talking
first
about
references to the Burak in the Islamic sources are to Abraham, not to Muhammad. And in fact, the Burak comes up in reference to a poem, right? This poem apparently written like 150 years after Muhammad dies. And it's a poem about how Abraham travels, and the Muslims borrowed that because they were being asked, how in the heck does Muhammad or does Abraham travel between Beersheba, where he lives, or Bethel, and Mecca? How the heck does he get there in a day and back? And so they took this idea of a poem, and then they suddenly created the Burak. So, wow, thank you, Frane Sustic, for $5. Let's see what they say. I'm talking about layers as in editors. Would it be something like Muhammad plus early editors, Umayyad layer, Abbasid editors, Ottomans? Okay, from that perspective, yeah, we can be more specific. So analysis done on the Quran tells us you've got at least 200 years, I'd say 200 years of editing that went into it, and anything from a couple of dozen major authors. So you're looking at anything up to 100, but at minimum, you're looking at a couple of dozen, say 30, as one analysis did. If you analyze the text, the words, the structure, the way of writing, you can find 30 different authors, different geographies over a 200-year period. Odon, your thoughts on that?
This is a discussion we had. It's about the Jean-Jacques Walter or Walter thesis. But I told you at the time that his hypothesis about the 200 years span of writing for the Quran, I think it's a flawed hypothesis, because it relies on another hypothesis, which is that the word cool, that we find in some verses, the beginning of verses, were added when or just after the Quran was declared as the divine word, as the word of God. Because otherwise, without those words, without those say prophet, do this, say this, do that, some of the verses could obviously not be understood as God's word or God's commandments.
Right. And also chronologically, my final point here is that you're looking at probably a Christian lectionary section, or as a substrate, which seems to be Aramaic or Syriac rather. Then you've got some kind of
really.
That's
You're thinking about the lectionary.
That's what. That's what. No, not Gertrude. That's what the guy who speaks about the Aramaic in the Quran. Christoph Luxemburg. He mentions the lectionary, I believe.
Yeah, he mentions it, but that's the Quran is nothing like a lectionary.
Yeah, but originally the underlying Arabic layer seems to have been derived from a lectionary, and then somehow magically abracadabra gets transformed into something else, into bad Arabic, and then
should it be so? Everything from the original lectionary has been replaced. So
yeah,
but
like there's enough Aramaisms left in it to tell you it came from a Christian source. But that seems to be what some scholars think, and then you've got these Arabic layers, and it transforms a handful of times.
Yeah.
So
there's a thing about such things in French when we refer to a knife without a blade, out of which the handle has been taken off. So is it still a knife?
True. I mean, but it had to start somewhere, and it seems to be. Yeah, it's a hard question to answer, but
I think the starting point was the preacher's notes. There were preachers preaching in Arabia. They took notes for their preaching, for their. They also had instructors, teachers teaching them what to preach, and this was the material, the raw material out of which the Quran was edited and fabricated.
But then that makes it similar, in my mind, to the Didache. It's a similar instruction manual. So what if this was a rival to the Didache? They
But
took
this
the
is
Didache
nothing like a lectionary.
Sorry again?
This is nothing like a lectionary. We have this false idea of the Quran being a lectionary because the word Quran means lectionary.
I blame the scholars for that, Odon. I blame these PhD scholars in academia who have millions of dollars of funding. I do not blame myself here. That's what they told me.
But there's a thing. There is a very simple things to help make the difference, to help understand what the Quran is about. If you read the text, the Quran, it speaks about a book which is named Quran, which is supposed to be written in a clear and understandable Arabic. But if you look at the Quran, it's not written in a clear and understandable Arabic. So when you come across a verse referring a book written in clear and in a clear Arabic language, it cannot be the Quran. It must be another book.
Right. We're hijacking JC's thesis here. JC,
JC,
your thoughts on this? I mean, these are I mean, real questions that we have. I mean, we're trying to get to these answers. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I saw that your 200-year span of writing the Quran, and I'm going to raise you to about 1,300 years because the Quran was not really finalized until 1985. But jokes aside,
that's true.
There are yeah. So, but yes, we know that it's particularly once we actually get to the Ottomans, they did things. But when we look at the Quran, it makes no sense. It has no order. It has different grammar, different everything. So it does look almost like somebody just going around and taking pieces of things that people had been writing.
Also, a lot of it was edited by people who did not speak first language native Arabic. A lot of those people who spoke very bad Arabic. If you have the Quran from Saint Murad and you read it, it makes no sense half the time. I don't know. I have no idea what's going on. So when you read it, and the English is supposed to be an accurate representation of the Arabic, which tells you the Arabic is just incomprehensible, which means he says it is grammatically broken. The diction is completely just random, and Christian Prince says the same. It is a completely illegible, completely irrational, just totally incomprehensible book. He says it makes no sense. So I mean, but in that sense, we now can understand if the English is accurate to the Arabic, that it makes no sense at all. It's just, and that's why it had to have a narrative placed on top of it to try and make sense of the garbage that it is.
Well, I think it's probably on the next slide. I have one extract to do with Salman, and then a little bit later on, I have something about Umar. So maybe when we see those and how they are actually written, maybe we can actually say, okay, fine, so these things would be written here or there or in this manner, and for what reason. And actually I have as well one extract, a little piece from the book from Saint Murad. So because it's very important, and maybe that gives us a little bit more context. But I think that's actually on the next slide. So if we can actually like have a look at that one and then we discuss it, that'd be great. So very briefly about the storytelling, because we said that this guy was very much connected to the whole thing of prophethood. So we have the same story. I wrote down first person. I wrote down first person and third person is, well, two different individuals. On the one hand, Muhammad goes to Syria, he meets a monk, and he says, "You're a prophet." On the third person is Salman goes to Syria, he meets a monk, and he says, "You're going to find a prophet." You can see that whatever story was actually being told to begin with, it evolved into two different people. They're both linked to Syria, both linked to a Christian monk, but that actually, and yes, I'm going to address this, which is what we started discussing before the show, which is it doesn't actually make any sense that this Salman guy would actually ever speak with a Christian of any denomination and saying there is going to be a prophet. If they were Christians, they would never say that. They would say 666 years since the death and resurrection of Jesus, the Antichrist is coming, go find him, kill him. Because no one would say, no Christian of any kind would say somebody else is coming. However, if he was talking with a Jew, they would have said, look, we had a Muhammad and he didn't build the temple. And then we had another Muhammad and he didn't build the temple. Any moment now, we're going to have a Muhammad and he's going to build the temple. So I think those stories would have come a little bit something to do with this guy, Jewish influence, the title of Muhammad, being expelled from Jerusalem, going back, conquering Jerusalem, which is in the end Umar, and all of that. That story of the Muhammad is obviously Jewish. So this guy getting the information about a prophet from a Christian is a big no-no. Maybe a Jew, definitely not a Christian. Would you guys agree with that?
I partly get the impression that this might also be an effort to delegitimize Christianity, to make it a transitional religion, so that we end up with, because a Christian says, well, okay, actually the real religion, and that's coming with this Momo guy that's going to be born in like a year or two. In fact, there he is on a camel coming down the street in Syria. So yeah.
There's really something going on with this Salman al-Farisi character. You see, he's supposed to have converted to Christianity according to the Islamic narrative, but it's not Christianity literally. Literally, it's Nazarenism. He became a Nazarene. Nazarene are Jews, actually. They are not Christians. And they were settled in Syria. The story about meeting a monk. The monk name is Bahira. Bahira in Aramaic, it means teacher. He meets a teacher who tells him about prophecy and so on. If you look in the Islamic narrative, you have other characters, other figures such as Salman al-Farisi. You have Waraka bin Naufal. He was a Jew who supposedly converted to Christianity. He was a Christian in Mecca, in pagan Mecca, which is utter nonsense. And it's the same. It's a guy, a Jew, who converted to Nazarenism. Nazarenism is this very strange Jewish group who believed in Jesus' messiahship, but opposed Christianity because he did not believe he was God.
So he didn't believe in his divinity nor the Trinity.
Yeah, no Trinity. Jesus was only a man whom God had given power, and maybe the power to rebuild the temple. Let's not forget about Jesus' prophecy in the gospel. Jesus said that should you destroy the temple, I will rebuild it in 3 days. So he is a Muhammad in the Jewish meaning of the expression, because he's supposed to rebuild the temple. He is the one who, at the end of times, will rebuild the temple. So he's another very strong candidate for those who are waiting for a Muhammad to rebuild the temple. So, of course, he won't be a candidate for rabbinic Jews. But for some Jews who believed he was the Messiah, it might fit.
Well, the Jews were waiting for the Muhammad to rebuild the temple, and that did happen, and it didn't really go too well for them. So,
go according to plan.
So, this guy then, was it Salman? We have this story as well from, I suppose that one is the life of Muhammad. So it says that this guy we're going to basically find him now in the Quran. So this guy goes to, works for a bishop. He says, hey, I want to serve under you. That guy is a bad man. He describes him as such. He asks for alms, and then he puts him in his own coffers. And it says, and he did not give to the poor. He had collected 7 jars of gold and silver. So that is recorded after hundreds of years. People are still telling about the stories that are being told about this guy. It doesn't really matter if they are true or false, but they're telling the stories. And we're going to see now one of these, say, splits. By the way, this one, which I don't think has relevance, but I will just mention it, that it says that when that guy died, the bad guy, the bad bishop, he told people, hey, this guy has been stealing from you. And then they took the corpse of that guy and they crucified him, even though the guy was already dead, which, these people actually hold a grudge. But I did actually wonder whether that whole thing about they did not crucify Jesus has something to do with his previous experience, something to do with that, because it's odd that we have in his own story someone being crucified, and actually somebody that is dead. I just found it a little bit out of place, instead of just saying, the Barnhem or something, but never mind. But the whole thing about the 7 jars. So in the Quran, this is actually from the version that, one of the versions that I use the most. For most people, it will not be verse 31, it will be verse 30. But we have this parallel of they have taken their rabbis and monks as lords besides Allah and the Messiah and so on. And verse 34 or 33, depending on the version people are reading, it will say, many of the rabbis and the monks devour the wealth of people unjustly and avert from the way of God. And those who hoard gold and silver and spend it in other ways. It's like if you put these things together, you realize that Solomon is the one speaking these verses. He's the one that says these sort of things. His own experiences, hoarding literally gold and silver, that is, he's saying these things in the Quran. He's also telling this, well, not in the Quran, he's just telling people that they obviously write them down. And at one point in the future, they become the Quran. But he's telling those stories. That same story ends up, on the one hand, in the Quran, perhaps in a more poetic manner. And on the other one is him telling the stories. And just to add there, this is from Saint Murad. I found it actually odd when I was actually working on that one, that it says that these people, they took their rabbis and their monks as lords, apart from Allah plus the Messiah. This is, and then it says there is only one God. They have to serve one God. What I'm reading there, and I think it's very clear in the very clear Arabic, is that when this guy spoke the words to that particular crowd, in whichever city he was telling them that Allah and the Messiah are their lords and they are one. But the story actually changes. That's why in the Quran you have that Jesus received signs, but also he received a book, and also he didn't die, but also he did die. It's almost like he's telling different stories to different people in different places, and we will see that. But I think this is the verse that nails this guy. We have people were telling the stories of him having that experience, and that's directly right there in the Quran, and actually in the last surah to be revealed, which is fun. And by the way, Google Translate actually agrees. So, any thoughts about that?
Just a comment from Villainous.
Just a precision. In Surah 9, verse 30, it's about the Jews and about the Nazarenes. The Nazarenes are supposed to have taken the scholars and monks as lords beside God, plus the Messiah. So again, we come across the Nazarenes. Who are the Nazarenes? That's the question.
Villainous asks, is Salman the Parsi, which Salman the Persian, could he be Solomon the Pharisee?
I saw that actually on one of the videos from Mel at Islamic Origins, and it's a very good case. It's possible as well, but basically what I'm trying to do is from the stories of Islam to actually get those same stories and say, okay, are these stories anywhere in the Quran and these sort of things to match them? Other parts of his backstory that is outside of the life of Muhammad and Al-Tabari and all of those things is like, yeah, possible, but it takes me too far away from trying to pin this guy and Umar to them being the original inspiration for the Muhammad that goes, builds the temple, and starts a heresy that has worked so well for the world. I'm going to skip this because just for anyone who wants to actually freeze this, there are many, many, many hadiths that are those kind of hadiths that talk about Muhammad being kind of like nice and being pious. So if anyone wants to see them now, if you read them thinking, could this be actually talking about Salman, and then they just change the name, you might actually get the answer, and the answer being, yeah, that actually makes sense. Because then we have one hadith like this one from actually narrated by Umar, which is interesting. And it says, do not exaggerate in praising me, being the prophet, as the Christians praise the Son of Mary, for I am only a slave, so call me slave of Allah. And it's like, okay, if we know anything about the arc of Muhammad, is he wants to be praised. He wants the money, he wants the booty, he wants the women, he wants the land. People worship him to this day. They commit shirk every single day. They are praying to him. That hadith makes absolutely no sense of the Prophet saying, don't exaggerate in praising me. If there's one thing that we know about the whole arc of Muhammad is he wants to be praised. It's almost like we're talking about two different individuals, one who is quite pious and one who is the warlord. And I think we have both of them right on that hadith. Would you agree with that reading of this?
Yeah, I agree. It's very interesting. We start to understand that Muhammad, as the prophet of Islam, is a composite figure with many different characters having been merged, and the prophet of Islam is a sort of fabrication from maybe historical figures, but it's a complete fabrication.
We can also interpret this in a different way, because some of these words have meanings that we are not familiar with in the English language or in the Western culture. Remember I mentioned the ilm al-badi, the science of rhetoric, of prettifying language. The word exaggerate in Islam has a very specific meaning. It's like a, legal terms that we use on a casual basis, but in law they have a specific defined meaning when applied in a court or in a document, right? So the idea of exaggeration, they have this idea called mubalaga in Islam, right? So it's used to denote the intensive meaning of a word, and it's applied to the intensive participles of the forms, and in literary theory and so on, and to denote a very specialized type of emphasizing the meaning we want here, a very specialized type of emphasizing, right, in which a poetic idea is rounded out by a pertinent little exaggeration at the end of the line. Okay, that's one idea. Let me just find it again. So it's a particular poetic style or a particular prose style, right? And then of course you get, from a negative point of view, there's what they call extremists who are accused of exaggeration, and these extremists are also associated with the Shia, who exaggerate their religion. So that's one meaning. But what if he's saying, do not exaggerate in praising me the way the Christians praise the Son of Mary, for I'm only a slave? He's saying, look, I admit, yes, I am the slave of Allah and his apostle, but don't embellish me. Just speak of me humbly. He could well be saying that. He's not denying it. He's just saying, yes, I am, for sure. I am the Muhammad, but just speak about me in humble terms.
Praise me, but not too much.
Yeah, praise me, but not too much. Exactly. Because this would be very consistent. You can easily make this as the translation here.
Yeah, because we don't praise me too high. Just give me all of your money, all of your land, all of your women.
Yeah.
Right. So a few parallels with these two guys that I think could have influenced that is, well, Salman doesn't have any siblings. He doesn't have any parents around in that region. They are both, the stories of both of them are linked to Christian monks in one place, in another place, and all of that. They have links to Syria. Some of the stories are described as pious. They both have obviously the links to prophethood, and the life of Muhammad actually explains that as well in more detail. They're both described as scouts in a number of places, and maybe we'll cover that in a minute. I have to speed run through things I think we really want to get through Salman and Umar, because like this, everything is with a nice, we tie everything up with a nice bow. This guy had one wife. And we have the arc of Muhammad having first one wife and being very nice and alamin and all of that, and then having all of those wives and sex slaves and stuff. And it's like, well, explanation one, it was not Jibril, it was Satan. Explanation two, we're talking about two different people giving that story, because you don't just change that much just because you reach 40. They're the same age, by the way, both of them, and they both have no idea about the afterlife. In different hadiths explains that. And just shoehorning that if this guy was a Zoroastrian to begin with, he prays 5 times. That is actually not in the hadiths, in the Quran. So I think that may be the reason why they're praying 5 times a day when it's not even in their book. And
there's another thing about Salman that connects him to Muhammad. In the Islamic literature, he's supposed to be a member of the Ahl al-Bayt, the people of the temple. Bayt is temple, or the household of Muhammad, according to the Islamic narrative. So he is also linked, this Salman al-Farisi, with the temple. I think it refers to the temple in Jerusalem.
Actually, I haven't seen that, but that's actually great. The temple during the time of Umar, it was called like that, like Bait something. So the temple or the Holy Temple, something of the sort. So that would actually link the two of them with that. And there is other things as well in Al-Tabari, which I didn't understand. They call him like a member of the house or something like that, even though he was in theory first a slave and then he becomes one of the companions, which of course I don't think that any of that happened. But that's actually a very good point. And and I think that links him as well to what happened in Jerusalem and him having the knowledge in all of this. Now, during his, like, say, warrior days, there are a number of things. He's described as being a scout. This actually happens in quite a few places in Al-Tabari again and again. But then he also leads people. Like at one point, he starts to lead people, particularly into like Iraq and those sort of areas, telling people, join us, pay us, or we kill you, the usual thing. Then at one point he's like crossing a river. This is actually recorded in their book of history. Like he's crossing a river, and people are following him, and things like that. He's described again in there in another section as a scout. He was responsible as well for the call to prayers, but that applies to everyone in Islamic history. So never mind that. He's also described as, according to Al-Tabari, look, one of the most popular figures in Muslim legend. Oh, good. So they call him as part of a legend. So it's no longer history, it's a legend. I love it. And that's what we're trying to unpick. And because of he was an ardent supporter of Ali, he's actually quite important in the Shia traditions as well, in creating the whole thing. But I didn't check the Shia traditions because I really don't care. Now, a couple of other things is the Battle of the Trench, which we've all heard about. Do you guys know who had the idea of doing that trench for the Battle of the Trench?
Salman, of course.
Yeah, and don't you find that kind of interesting? I mean, in the old days, you knew that if you were in a defensive position, the first thing that you do is you entrench yourself. But the idea came from this guy, and one of the battles that has that name, Battle of the Trench. And when you ask the trench, oh yeah, that was Salman, and he's like, yeah, man, like this guy was the prophet. Yeah.
Owen Robertson. Apologies for the interruption, but I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. Owen Robertson. She says John of Damascus made no mention of warrior kings, caravan robbing, executions, or wives. And Saint Murad removes the sin from the Quran and does not find words for spoil of war, battle of Badr, revelation, or wife. That's a fantastic comment. Thank you. That is amazing. And thank you for the donation. That is very generous. But yeah, that's a very, I mean, someone just joined the dots there. That is incredible. Your thoughts on that, Odon?
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. I don't fully agree with everything Murad writes in his translation, because words might have different meanings in Aramaic also, but I fully agree that the Battle of Badr is a complete fabrication. Same as the Battle of the Trench, I think so also. But yeah, it's a very interesting coincidence. And I think it's not a coincidence. It's there's something
Well,
here.
there was another thing that from Saint Murad that he said that he has removed that specific word, and I can't remember now, but I thought, wow, I have to kind of revise absolutely everything because this is going to change like lots of things. From his translation, yes, there are lots of things that really change absolutely everything, and is going to be a game changer. In terms of Badr, which we know that Badr is not a battle but a place, and that was actually the next one that I actually had there, because I think there are different stories about the Battle of Badr. One of them, from Yasser Qadi, he has it there, is about 15-hour videos, like all of them put together. And if you have excessive alcohol at home and you want to get rid of it, watch that series and the alcohol will deplete very quickly. 15 hours talking about a battle that should be explained in 2 minutes. But the odd thing is Salman is not in that battle, but before the battle, on the eve of battle, Muhammad, and in here it says one of the companions, I think it's Abu Bakr, they go on a scouting mission, and they actually encounter another guy who says, hey, where are you from? And then, Muhammad gets all of the information from the other guy, he tricks him, and then he runs away. Now, why would you ever, on the eve of battle, if you are the most important person in the whole army, with the second most important, go out to scout? You don't do that. Who was the scout? That was Salman. The guy that asked the question from the other army was like, which side are you from? There are different stories. Like, where do you come from? It's like, if the guy that they saw was Muhammad, he was supposed to be from Mecca. He would speak the same dialect. They would know exactly who he was. The Muhammad that they encountered before that battle would have been the typical scout. That would have been Salman. The guy that is Persian, he looks different, he has different accent, and it will confuse the other guy. Also, I do have a feeling that the Battle of the Trench and the Battle of Badr is exactly the same battle that happened wherever it is. So we're not talking about two different battles, but just one battle that has been split into two, but because of strategic reasons. The strategy of particularly the Battle of Badr, makes zero sense. But maybe that's something that we can talk about in the future if you guys are interested. But yeah, the typical scout, Battle of Badr, Muhammad is the scout that gets all of that information. So I'm pretty sure it was him. So Umar, he has quite a few things in parallel with the Muhammad who never existed. Well, born in Mecca, died in Yathrib. Now, I can think of another person who was born in Mecca and died in Yathrib. The thing is, nobody cares if that was the case. Even if Umar happened to be, a guy from the Lahnets or from Merv or a Chinese, those things that don't matter. What matters is that they have carried that information themselves, and they happen to be like from the same cities. But also, Umar is the one that institutes the calendar. And by the way, the calendar of the Christians is based on the birth of Jesus. Their calendar, if it was something to do with Islam, he should have done either the birth or maybe the death of Muhammad. But he chooses that weird Hijra thing. It's like that date was important to him. Otherwise, he would have chosen a religious, say, date. This guy stamps documents. He assembled people to one imam. That's all on the screen from that extract, which you would have thought it would have been the prophet who assembled people to one imam. And the most hilarious one, according to Al-Tabari, he appoints two public Quranic readers, one for men, one for women. Well done. I mean, they don't have the book. They haven't done the canonization. This is before Uthman. And what are they reading? Like the codices from the Sahaba. It's like it doesn't make any sense. But that one is attached to this guy, him and Quran. And then we have that story as well, very weird, which is, again, Umar and Salman, they are speaking, and this is in Al-Tabari. Umar asking Salman, am I a king or a caliph? And Salman says, you're a piece of garbage, man. And the guy starts crying, okay? That's weird. That's very weird. Why would you have that in Al-Tabari? Why would Umar be asking Salman something like, am I a king or a caliph? It's like, makes no sense. Now,
So
if
Salman had the power to tell the Caliph Umar, the Rashidun Caliph, the rightly guided companion of Muhammad, where to get off.
he was like what, moral support, like an advisor, almost. He
Okay.
was, obviously, he had many roles according to their own stories, but it seems like they go to him because he's almost like a wise man or something of the sort, or at least that's what I get
Okay,
from
so an
that story.
advisor of some type. Right.
Yeah. So he was the one with all of the, religious stories. So I
The
suppose that
vizier.
makes sense. Yeah, the vizier. He was maybe the first one. So if Muhammad and Abu Bakr didn't exist and we don't have any records for them, then everything falls to Umar and people after. According to Al-Tabari, there are many, many accounts of this, but who was the first person to believe in the messenger? So, and you have Ali, Abu Bakr, who was Ali, and then Ali, and then Ali, and then Ali. So it's normally Ali. If you don't have Muhammad and Abu Bakr, everything then falls on the laps of Umar, who is the first one to actually go into battle with this guy. And it would have been Ali, who is Abu Turab, whoever that person actually who he was. And recap on John of Damascus. Oh, I like that this slide. So Muhammad had a friend named Zaid. So he gets it wrong, not adopted son, and he says, God wants you to divorce your wife. God wants me to marry your wife. That's the kind of person you really want around. And then this weird thing, this is from John of Damascus, and it happens straight after. Furthermore, if a brother puts away his wife, let his brother marry her, should he so wish. That is very weird. Well, Umar was married to a Zainab, but that's fine because it was a very common name. He had a brother called Zaid. There is no records that I could find that Zaid was married to Zainab, but we're trying to find parallels between the stories that we know about Muhammad and the stories that we know about Umar. And they're just stories. None of it has to be real, but Muslims would have been telling these stories and they would have diverged into the two different paths. But the interesting thing is this one. Another of his wives, of Umar's wives, was the daughter of Ali. She was still a child. When she was still a child, he asked for her hand in marriage, which was resisted by Ali. Now, we have all heard the story a million times about Muhammad wanting to marry Aisha, Abu Bakr not being very happy with it. She was still a child. I don't know if anybody's getting a weird case of deja vu right now, because I am. And more details on that. So he asked her hand in marriage during his reign, 634 to 644. It's very possible that this guy, and I really think that Umar might have been even the caliph from much earlier, but this is the stories that they've been telling. So we're playing with their stories. 634 to 644 is what they have been telling us. She was still a child. The thing is, if they actually then got married, like 1 year after he became the caliph, according to this, they would have been married for 9 years. Once again, exactly the same as the story of Muhammad and Aisha, the daughter of the would-be caliph. And he would have been 52 years old at the time. The story, I don't know if it was a very common thing at the time, that every single caliph, or let's say every single king, would marry the child daughter of a future king for a period of 9 years before he gets murdered. Maybe it was a common thing. I just find that this is a parallel that created the whole myth of Muhammad, because it's just too many things, and including the being a child.
And
Any
they would
thoughts on
try to
this one?
create a template based on a factual precedent. So it helps them because they don't have to invent it out of whole cloth. They can simply use something that's real within their environment, which they can modify.
Yeah, it's impossible to create something from scratch unless you actually start talking about dragons or something like that. If you're trying to create a story, you would have to create it from an actual real story. And that is actually assuming that there is no foul play. That I'm actually just assuming that they really heard these stories and they were trying to put them together in good faith, which most likely it wasn't. But even if we assume that there was good faith, the stories came from someplace. And I think this one here is like, come on, like the parallel is just too
In the
ridiculous to just
hadiths,
ignore.
Muhammad wants to marry Aisha, and her father, Umar, says he's not happy with that. And here you've got Umar ibn al-Khattab asked for hand in marriage, which was resisted by Kulthum and her father Ali. So you've got a very similar parallel in the hadiths as well.
Yeah, it's the whole thing. It's the same story. It has to come from someplace. And I think this one was the original story. And then on the one hand, it goes down as the real story. And on the other one, it evolves into Muhammad. And we're going to see then other things. In this one, well, they're both son-in-laws, but everybody was pretty much inbred in a village, so nobody cares. But then there is this one, which is weird. I said before, in the story of Salman, I was there to his father rather than the whole world. So he, Salman, was there to his father than the whole world. Then we have like a hadith like this of Umar saying to the Prophet, now you are dearer to me than my own self. And it's like, come on, I mean, maybe just literary thing. This argument is naive, but there is that parallel. And the same with this one. We showed the slide with that extract when I said
No, but that's in the
Salman
Sharia, that the Prophet has to be dearer to you. That's actually in the Sharia. Muhammad must be dearer to you. You must love Muhammad more than you love your mother, your father, your wife, your sister, your brother, even your own life, even yourself. You have to love Muhammad with your whole heart above anything and everything else in the world. So this hadith.
Yeah, and doesn't that then when you read that I was dearer to him than the whole world, that almost same words that you have just said about the most important thing happen to be attached to the story of Salman?
Yeah, and by him in whose Salman's soul lies. That's a parallel of what Muhammad says.
Yeah, so in that same hadith that says this thing that about being more important than anything else, says the like word for word like the same, but of course it's a translation and artistic license, and maybe it was a very common thing. I just found it odd that by him in whose hands Salman's soul lies, and on the other one is the Prophet saying, by him in whose hands my soul is. It's like, come on, this is Salman using his favorite sentence, left, right, and center. I found that I just left it there. Umar narrating that alcohol is made of things. I don't know why you have a hadith of one guy saying that alcohol is made from things. Why would you have that? I thought the hadiths are supposed to be the sayings of the Prophet, not a saying of Umar saying alcoholic drinks come from 5 things. It's like, Umar, nobody cares. We're here for the Prophet. And this other narration, if you look at the hadiths from Umar, you're going to start seeing what is going on. Umar narrating the Prophet saying that if he lived, he would expel the Christians and the Jews from the Arabian Peninsula. And it's like, no, Umar, that wasn't the Prophet. That was you. The guys who wrote the hadith said that he was the Prophet, but that was just you. So there are other parallels, like narrated by him, like a couple of things there. That one is not very important, but the next one is, so narrated by Umar, a man will not be asked as to why he beat his wife. What a lovely guy. In that section that we saw before, the alleged marriage to the little girl, Ali didn't want him to marry her because of his reputation for harsh treatment of women. And then another one, Umar says, blah, 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 and a verse is revealed in the Quran. And another one, Umar says, blah, 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 and a verse is revealed. That means that Umar was a real prophet. He knew what Allah was going to reveal before Allah revealed it. What a guy. But this is almost like the one that I think simply just nails him, which is, this is the extract just from Prophet ChatGPT, peace be upon him. The hadith mentioning that Allah agreed with Umar in 3 matters. And actually, ChatGPT said, actually, sometimes it says more, appears in several collections. So let's have a look. Hijab. The reason why women wear hijab this day is because Umar opened his mouth and then a verse was revealed. That's a bit of a coincidence. Captives of Badr. The Prophet wanted to be lenient with the captives, and Umar wanted to kill them. So he opened his mouth, and then Allah reveals, kill them all. So the reason why in Muslim countries they do lots of executions, it also comes to the words of Umar. Very importantly, he's the one that said, hey, maybe we should pray in one direction instead of creating a church or something of the sort that
And
has
they even
no
call it the
direction.
Pact of Umar for the Demisan Jizya.
Pardon?
They even call it the Pact of Umar to describe the whole contract with Demisan Jizya.
It seems like he just and you know what, I never hear people talking about Umar, and now that I'm doing a lot of research into him, it's like this guy did everything. Like he was about everything, he was everywhere. But so this final thing, the direction of prayer, to this day they are praying in one direction. The first masjids, they were not, say, like a church that doesn't have a direction. It was commanded that they would pray in one direction, that of course now they get it wrong because it was Petra, but the idea of praying in one direction, it was him, he says that, and then as if by magic it appears in the Quran. And then now when we read that verse from the Quran about that you can strike your wives, does it now look like, was it Salman, was it Jesus, or was it Umar? And the one about if he divorced you all, Allah might give him better wives. Well, maybe Umar, if you don't beat your wives to death, they might actually not make your life difficult. So we see Umar saying things, and then those things appear in the Quran, which of course is simply this guy saying things to the crowd. There is no Quran, there is no such thing. And then years later, people are writing things that have happened, and they are attaching those stories to the Muhammad. And it is Muhammad who says, we are praying in that direction because of the Quran. And it's like, no, you're praying in that direction because Umar said it. So all of these things, and I think, which one was the next? Oh, yeah. So we're pretty much done with Umar, but I think it is this guy who, he's the one creating Quran. He and Salman, we have different these sections. Anything violent, well, hijab, the prayer, strike them and divorce them. It was all about him, and we've pretty much ignored him. Or at least that's what I think, and I feel quite strongly about it because he built Quran according to their own sources. What do you guys think?
Can I go on? There's something of a pattern here, for sure. But the thing is that almost for every example you took, it's not historical. If I take the example of the station of Abraham, Umar suggests that it would be good if the Muslim took the station of Abraham, the standing place of Abraham near the Kaaba, as a place of prayer. This is a complete fabrication. For example, it's the standing place of Abraham is in Jerusalem. There was nothing of the sort in Mecca. It's a complete invention. But the thing that is very interesting here.
So sorry, but just to add that the thing is that none of these stories had to be correct in any possible
exactly
manner.
That's my point.
The thing is
that's
that
my point.
Yeah,
you have to go beyond the correctness of the story to recognize the pattern, and the pattern is that Umar was influential in the making of the Quran. Somehow he was, and it is very interesting what you have uncovered here. There are I have other things in mind about Umar. In the Islamic literature, it is also said that he might have come from Syria. Might be a Syrian connection, mostly due to his name. Ibn al-Khattab is a very strange name, and it's very close to Hatab, Hatab meaning lumberjack. And there are traditions, Islamic traditions, about his father, so Al-Hatab or Al-Katab, having been a lumberjack in Mecca, which is complete nonsense since there are no forests in the region of Mecca. But there are forests in Syria, and it might be another clue for the identity of Umar. And there's another thing that we discussed before going live. It's Umar's nickname. According to the Islamic narrative, he was nicknamed by Muhammad Al-Faruq. Al-Faruq meaning the savior, the one who separates good from evil, the one who judges good from evil, which is a messianic title also. It comes from Aramaic, and it was given to Jesus. Jesus is Al-Faruq. It's the same root as Al-Furqan, the criterion. The Furqan is also a way of understanding that there is something that separates good from evil. So Umar is also a sort of messianic figure, a messianic character. Like Ali, like Salman, like many, not so many, but some people in the narrative about early Islam.
The connection with the north, particularly if they were Syrians, one of the things I would be very happy with that, because Damascus becomes the capital like quite early on, by the time that we get to the Umayyads. So it's possible that all of these people, they were actually always from there. It then went south, do the whole sweep to create their empire, basically unifying their taking advantage of the Persians being weakened, and they always remained in there. And the whole thing about no, Medina, Mecca, is like Mecca didn't exist. You guys had one well. You can probably support like 3 guys and a donkey. That's about it. So, but I did have like other slides, and it was about more of the theory of how I think things could have moved. And you've seen actually the slides, but we obviously don't have time for that. We're nearly on the 2-hour mark. I'm just going to finish with this final, almost like closing remarks. So who was Muhammad? Was it Salman or Jesus, Umar, Ali? Maybe Muhammad Al-Amin. That's actually a caliph from the Abbasids called that. Maybe some imams, Abdul Malik, or other companions. And the answer is yes, just a whole mess, like we all know. Everybody just put together. A little bit like James Bond, having one character that we know, but then there are lots of different people, or perhaps more like Doctor Who. Or the favorite example is a Jackson Pollock's style of religion. So we have a lot of people, lots of influences. They don't have a character, so it's just a blank canvas. So they just have to throw everything into it, and then you end up with basically a soup. Like Lloyd always says, it's a soup, and it really is. And the reason is because there isn't one character that you have just copied and said things about his story. That's why his story doesn't make any sense. And when people analyze the character of Muhammad, say, well, he was crazy. And it's like, no, it's like having multiple personality disorder. It's like you have 20 people in one. So by putting all of those stories together, you end up some historical, some not historical. You end up with Muhammad, and you end up with a standard Islamic narrative, which has many holes in it. And probably I will just stop there before going on the other slides. I don't know how to stop sharing.
Oh, that's very good.
Huh? If you would be so kind as to help me stop sharing, please. Oh, thank you very much. So, yeah, or rather, to conclude, I think, yes, like we all know that Muhammad was many, many, many people and stories from all over the place. But it does seem like the guys that started pretty much the whole thing might have been actually these two. We have it at least on good authority from Leo III. And before that time, if he actually became the caliph in the year 634, before that time, maybe he was the caliph actually for longer, because all of the information that we get is from the standard Islamic narrative. Or there would have been other guys. Sorry?
So now we've got some early sources pre-Uthman who may well be influential in creating the narrative of the Quran?
Pri Uthman. I think, and that was something like I was going to discuss on other slides, that these guys, I think the reason why there are so many contradictions is many reasons, and obviously it takes hundreds of years and there are changes, but it's the whole concept of Tawhid. I think these guys are walking around, they are telling people, join my army or we kill you, and they use anything that they can. Either it's extortion, deals, being good cop, bad cop, and some of them is just stories. So if you are licking a stone, they tell you, hey, don't worry, you're not a pagan. You're licking a stone, that is because you worship the one God that sent you the stone. We are friends. Join my
Hold on,
army. We
that's what
kill
I
you.
was saying the last couple of weeks. You might recall. I know you've got about a dozen slides or so to finish. So shall we maybe make a date for a week from now and finish this? Because I mean, this is interesting as to how the story got started, how they found parallels, turned them into the sin. Yeah, I mean, you know, because it's not like 1 + 1 is equal to 2. You can't judge it on those criteria. Because we're trying to think, how do liars tell lies? How do they tell credible lies? How do they construct a narrative that's based on things you know, but with a little bit of new? We know they exaggerate. We know that they embellish. We know that they're basing it on stuff you already know. You know, they're trying to be original without being overly plagiaristic. And so yeah, we can see. I mean, these character parallels, these historical parallels. It's there's too many of them to be coincidental, I think.
And there are many other coincidences that JC did not address. We did not talk about Ali, for example. Ali's figure is also very messianic, very Muhammad-like, and you put him among the different people that were merged to form the Prophet of Islam. But in the Shia Muslim tradition, he is said to have claimed to be Jesus himself.
Wow.
To have been the second coming of Jesus. Jesus as his second coming. So he would have descended from the heavens. So you see also a parallel with Isra and Miraj. Is someone who visited the heavens, who came back from the heavens, pretending to be Jesus, pretending to be what's the word? The parousia.
Parousia.
Parousia. And it's within the Shia tradition, which is very little known in the West. But luckily, here in France, we have a very interesting scholar, Mohammad Ali Amir Moedzi, who is from Iranian extraction. And he wrote many things about the things we can gather from the Shia tradition. He's a very, very interesting scholar. There are some videos of him in English that you can find on YouTube. Mohammad Ali Amir Moedzi. And there's another thing I would like to add. This is a very, very good presentation, JC. I'm impressed because you took different paths from mine, but in the end, I think we really converge. When you put Muhammad as a composite figure out of different characters, Salman and so on, I think there's also a very important component in the making of Muhammad, which is the whole plugger, all the things that had to be invented about the Muhammad in order to correct the incoherencies, to plug the holes in the narrative. There are many things about Muhammad in the Islamic tradition that are told only to correct discrepancies, incoherencies, and so on. I just take one example. there is this bizarre thing about the satanic verses. You know the story. In At-Tabari, there is a mention that in Surah 53, verse 19-20, there were parts that were edited out. And those parts were about Muhammad urging his audience to praise polytheistic divinities. And thereafter, I think it happened afterwards, we have many hadiths where Muhammad prohibits his audience from worshipping these very same deities, Al-Lat, Al-Manat, Al-Uzza. And these hadiths were invented to plug the hole, to plug the plot hole, to correct the incoherences. And this is a very big part, I think, in the making of Muhammad. There are historical influences, and there is the constraints of the fabrication of the narrative.
Yeah, so lots of things that they were done in good conscience, with good intention, and then when they realized that the whole thing didn't make any sense, you had lots of people saying, okay, now we really have to fudge the whole thing to make the square fit into the circle, and we get Islam.
That's the thing.
Right.
That's the thing.
Yeah. So the last few slides, the last 10 or so slides, shall we tackle that at a later date? We'll plan for that.
I'm up for it.
Yeah, for me, certainly. I will just try to put them in a different order so that we can pick it up in an easy way. And it will be more about how I think the moves happen with these people. But yes, whenever you guys are free, let me know, and then we can make it happen. And thank you both very much for being so kind, especially for not destroying me through the presentation and actually being very supportive and kind with your words. Supposed to say, no, that's a no, that's a no, that's a no. So thank you very much for being so patient.
No, praise me, but not too much.
Yeah.
Do not exaggerate in your praising.
Do not exaggerate in your praise. Be praiseful, but not exaggerating. Yes, exactly.
All
I think that's
to
the
Allah.
thing. So in which case he is Muhammad. If we interpret it that way, and there's every reason why it can be, then he is Muhammad.
Indeed.
Yeah. So guys, thank you all very much then. Thanks for this. We've hit the 2-hour mark, and I obviously try not to go too long. I mean, I know many channels do 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours. I know, I'm not sure, Adam Seeker contacted me yesterday, asked me to do some research for him on the word Hunafa. And I sent him a whole bunch of references and stuff. And so he goes on several hours with streams. So who knows, he actually asked me to do a stream with him one time recently, and except it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm like, I'd love to, but it's not really a suitable time. So let's hope we can arrange a different time. So guys, thanks all. Thank you for that, JC. That was very interesting. Definitely
Thanks,
strong food for thought. Odon said it was impressive. Odon has not said that about anything I've done. So
Ouch.
I'm feeling very hurt that I wasn't getting any praise at all. That's I'm gonna have to work.
You want some praising? You're so humble.
What's that?
You are so humble.
Yeah, I am, and it's to my detriment, I know. But okay, well, anyway, so guys, thanks all very much, and to the audience for the 130 of you at least, I think, that we hear. That's really great, and we shall see you all soon. We'll come back to this topic, and please leave your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what you think of this, and of course, please share it far and wide. And thank you for all the donations. Always much appreciated. Thanks, guys. Good night.
Thank you.